Welcome to the LPP podcast. LPP is shorthand for the Life Process Program, which is an online educational and coaching program that helps people leave addiction issues behind them by rebuilding the infrastructure of their lives. To find out more about the Life Process Program, visit lifeprocessprogram.com. I don't always do introductions, but this episode deserves one. Today, Dr. Peel and I talked about our thoughts on the concept of medication for addiction, specifically methadone and Suboxone. He and I agree that Suboxone and methadone are just drugs, and we're not against people taking drugs. And given our laws and societal pressures against drugs, we believe that it is a boon in the sense that these drugs are available as substitutions for people who wish to take them. But we also like to think bigger than that, for better or for worse. And we believe that if our work in making sense of addiction, and most importantly, saving people from dying of addiction and drug-related use, if we believe our work stops at, well, there are drugs available that can preserve the lives of people who use opioids. We can call them medicine, and that way we can continue to prescribe them. And meanwhile, we'll demonize other drugs. Okay, that's a straw man. But you see what I'm saying? If that's our stopping point, that's just too depressing. We, Stanton and I, believe that this is an incomplete picture of the concept of addiction and how we can solve drug deaths. So we talk most specifically today about Maia Szalavitz and her views about what she calls medication for opioid use disorder, MOUD, as opposed to medication-assisted therapy, MAT, which it used to be coined, which perhaps suggests that medication is assisting in the therapy and the therapy is what saved lives. Maia instead believes that therapy could be fine, yeah, but people should also just be given the damn drugs if they want them. And we actually agree with that to the extent that people should just have a place to get a reliable source of drugs. We disagree with her about a few fundamental of her beliefs, which we'll discuss in the podcast. Really, I wanted to record this intro so that people would know that this is not a hit piece on Maia. Maia Szalavitz, if you don't know her, she's a New York Times writer. She's written 2 best-selling books. She's co-authored a best-selling book, a 3rd best-selling book, and written a few others. She's extremely intelligent, and her work and research and advocacy in the addiction field and in health is very important. And her harm reduction efforts are not only laudable, I'd say she's currently a thought leader in that field, and whether or not that's a position she ever wanted to be in. So please keep in mind that even though Maia's name runs all the way through this discussion, we are simply making an appraisal of her ideas as sort of a leader in the field and also a colleague of ours in the field. And some of those ideas we agree with, some of them we do not. What we're not doing is disparaging her as a person. As far as I understand, she's always been up for discussing and debating these concepts because she thinks they're important. I don't stress out thinking that she's going to misunderstand the basis for today's podcast. And if I'm lucky, I'll get an email from her. I just hope that you see that I've made a good faith effort to ensure that you and anyone who comes across this episode can clearly parse the boundary between debating ideas and putting down another person. A last thing you should know is that I was very sick while recording this podcast, and I was isolating in my home, which I'm still doing this evening as I record this, but I'm feeling much better now. You can probably tell if you compare the 2 clips. All of that said, I hope you'll enjoy this discussion between Stanton Peel and me. Stanton, one of the interesting things about getting to work with you is the new contacts that I've made along the way. Some people who are historical figures, including yourself, in the field of harm reduction, addiction, thinking about alternatives to this disease idea of addiction. You know, it's more like a social and personal journey in life. And one of the people who has been incredibly interesting to get to know is Maia Szalavitz. Maia, when I first learned about her a few years ago when you and I met, was becoming an increasingly more prominent person in this field. I mean, when I met her, she had already written a New York Times best-selling book, Unbroken Brain. And of course, she and we share a lot of the same ideas about what addiction is or isn't, and specifically drugs and drug policy and harm reduction ideas. One of the ways we diverge is her idea about methadone, buprenorphine, as an effective modality for kind of kicking addiction, or I guess the way she sees it, beating drug fatalities. I'm going to let you in a minute talk about this in more depth because you're the one who has had these conversations with her, but we're on a list thread, including Maia Szalavitz and other prominent thinkers. And, you can't resist pinging thought leaders and saying, have you ever thought about it this way? Or don't you realize that? And then fill in the blank. A hobby horse of Maya's is to talk about medication for addiction. Interestingly, she thinks that we need to think about recovery in a different way. Maybe that's not for everybody. She herself has had a bout with heroin, and she was at a point in her life where she did heroin so frequently and to the distraction of other, potentially interesting things in her life that she was thin and malnourished and almost did jail time. She did AA, and then she writes articles against AA. But she has this one theory. She's on the autism spectrum, diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. So she thinks about her own journey through beating an addiction to heroin and other things as well.
And cocaine. She did heroin and cocaine at the same time.
Oh, that's right. She kind of did like a speedball mixture. She sees it as, she was an autistic person who had like things zinging around and a hard time focusing because of sensory input or a lack of ability to handle the sensory input. And so she started taking antidepressants, and that was super helpful to her. And there's some medications that were helpful to her. And I think somewhere along the way, she thinks of those things as medicines. She doesn't think about like, I'm on the autism spectrum, so I've kind of grown up and learned how to cope with life and deal with life and make my own way. So she thinks the medicine has saved her. And, we're not her, so we don't know what's going on. I think she's transferred that to this idea that there's a medication that can help people recover from a heroin addiction or opioid addiction. She certainly thinks, she continues to cite studies where in populations of heroin habitués or fentanyl habitués, that people who take methadone or Suboxone are their death rate is decreased by something like 50%. That's like the magic number that I hear in all these studies. When I look at the thread between Maia and you, what I understand you to be saying to her as a way of pushback is that, sure, being able to take a drug that's something like what you want to take, that can be helpful since, you're not vying for it. It can be predictable. It can be safer. But the idea that we can throw a type of drug that we call a medication at a problem that really is at the core a social issue, a personal issue, a life issue, that's folly. And if we can't wrap our minds around the fact that that's erroneous, we're going to repeat the same mistakes we've made since the beginning of this conceptualization of, addiction being some kind of disease. So I watch you two back and forth. I think understanding what the other person is saying, but I suppose there's a fundamental disagreement between you, and I'm always fascinated by it. And I wanted to bring it up today.
Well, we do kind of have these exchanges on this little bit of a list, and you watch it. I have a strange theory, which makes me not as popular as I might be. I feel that fundamentally, the major thinkers in drug policy and addiction really haven't changed their framework over the last century. And I think that Maia and Ethan and others, you said there are others who basically share a point of view, are basically in the same old camp. And let's start with they're anti-drug. So if you go back to the Harrison Act and the bad old days arresting people, well, drugs are bad. Okay, then you move into the brain disease and the 12-step movement, and drugs are bad. I mean, it's the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And AA, well, AA is about alcohol, but they're focused on the drug and alcohol. They're never going to say, well, alcohol is good or drugs are good or they're okay. And then we have the harm reduction movement. And Maia is totally identified in her own being, in her own mind, with the harm reduction movement. She's written a separate book on that. What's her second bestseller called?
Oh God, there's Unbroken Brain, and is it Undoing? Oh no,
Undoing Drugs.
Undoing Drugs. Is that what it is?
Undoing Drugs. Exactly right, Zach. So it's still undoing drugs. I mean, there's no room in her perception for like, well, why do you have to undo drugs? And she's made this little half step. She talks about going to rehab, and she was told she could never drink again, but she drinks again. So that part she's discarded. But she boasts, so she has a gig on Time and other places. She wrote, "How come I'm not in recovery?" She's not in recovery because she drinks, but she brags. She went to rehab in '88. She's never had heroin or cocaine since.
Okay, so you're talking about the incarnations of drugs are bad, and you're saying Maia has done this, sort of propelled herself beyond drugs are bad in a sense, and I like the term you used, sort of half back steps back into drugs are bad to some extent, while she says, I'm not in recovery. I don't use this language. I don't adopt these principles that, have been killing people for years. However, she is sort of identifying her favorite pieces of drugs are bad.
Right. She boasts in national magazines that she hasn't had drugs. I think she conceivably she takes marijuana. I don't know. She leaves that open. And she hasn't taken heroin or cocaine since 1988. I don't know why. On what basis doesn't she? And I guess I've never seen her answer that particular question, but she might say, well, given my particular makeup or my autism or my ADHD, or I don't know what she would say, I would become addicted to them. She hasn't had them since 1988 when she went to rehab and she weighed 88 pounds. And now she's a world famous, and in many ways, the embodiment of modern drug policy. She's married. Is she 50 years old now? Or I don't know.
In her 50s, yeah.
So she's sort of saying, drugs are bad and I can't handle these drugs. I never heard her say that exactly. But she says, why aren't I in recovery just because I drink wine, maybe take marijuana? So drugs are bad. Number two, how do you solve a drug problem? If the drugs are bad, you address the drug. And MAT or whatever, I have a hard time following her. She
calls it medication treatment.
Now she's in medication for opioid use disorder. But she sometimes racks me out and says that she's doing something else. But she talks about buprenorphine and methadone. And she says, look, the data are that when you go into a population and you give them those drugs, they're less likely to die. So that's her argument. That's a scientific basis. And therefore, and now let's slide back. She rejects AA's abstinence philosophy. So she's not going to take heroin or cocaine. She is going to drink and maybe take marijuana. And right in the middle are buprenorphine and methadone. And it's good. Harm reduction is good because it says you can take those drugs and they'll what word we plug in here, I don't know. Cure you, help you. I don't know what word exactly she wants to use there. And so that's her stomping grounds. And that's where the harm reduction movement is. Can you believe the 12 steps used to say you can never take any drugs? But, in methadone and buprenorphine are opioid or opioid like drugs.
And there's like she almost gets to where we are. That's why I think maybe it's so frustrating that she's a huge advocate for pain patients and people who have took opioids on the onset when they were prescribed drugs, as saying they're not addicting people. They're not doing the work of addicting all these people. They're safe, reliable. They're probably people who are nefarious in a sense and said, wanted to make money and prescribing them without actually believing they were going to help somebody. But they're not, they're not bad things. Heroin's not even a bad thing in its purity. And now, right, she says about herself, I'm not going to touch cocaine or heroin again. Look what they did to me before.
1988.
And there's, when I've spoken to her before, right, from 88 to now, I think she discounts about herself that a huge part of life and development took place where if she, for some reason, wanted to touch the drugs, she'd probably be okay. Given they were safe, she'd probably be okay. So for whatever reason, she thinks about those drugs. There's an association to her previous life, and it's fair enough. People do that, and I sometimes do that about myself. But on a logical basis, she still uses that. Well, look what they did. Look what the drugs did to me before,
and it's
as a reason for not doing them.
Focused. What I would say, what you might say is, I'm not addicted to drugs now. Boom. AA won't let me be in recovery, but I can tell you I'm not addicted to drugs now.
Right.
You wouldn't start arguing, oh, I haven't even had heroin or cocaine since 1988. That's a drug argument. Our argument would be, I'm kind of grown up, I'm married, I'm 50-ish, I'm kind of world famous. I'm not a drug addict anymore.
Right.
I'm not. And, it's sort of like, I'm not going to go through my resume and tell you what drugs I have or haven't taken. I can tell you I'm not a drug addict. That's it.
And so there is you're right when you say she is a spokesperson for the harm reduction movement now. And I remember politicians in my area, it was in the paper, and they're supposedly brave advocates for harm reduction, saying things like, we're going to legalize Suboxone. And or really what we're going to do is we're not going to arrest anybody if we find them in possession of life-saving drugs like Suboxone or methadone. We're going to arrest hard drugs.
Readily available. There's a constant debate.
Fine.
Can you take the drug at home? Can a regular pharmacist? Can a regular pharma? That's the constant debate.
And on the other,
how readily accessible.
On the other hand, in that same sentence, they add, "We're going to arrest people with the drugs that are killing everybody. Now we're going to arrest people with fentanyl and heroin. Yeah, those are drug arrests. We're not going to arrest people with life-saving medications in their possession." And so there is they're distributed in a certain way so that probably if someone has access to them, at some point in time, someone had them in their hands on the basis of, I want to do this and get better. Okay, I'll grant that. But there's still this idea that one drug is life-saving, the other is deadly and bad.
Maia, I think, is somewhere right in the middle of that. Of course, she's for more Suboxone and methadone. I don't think she wants to arrest people with heroin.
I don't think so either. I think that's one thing that she's very compassionate. If other people want to use any drug they want, she's like, okay.
She wants to ban fentanyl.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're getting down to that old joke. You know what I mean? would you do X for $1 million? Would you do X for a nickel? No, of course not. And then they say, well, you're the person who does X. So she's not against heroin, but she's against another opioid, fentanyl. There are people whose drug of preference is fentanyl. They give you fentanyl in the hospital. Fentanyl is a drug. It exists. People use, some people use it and die sometimes accidentally, but there's a marketplace for fentanyl users. And we could spend all day saying, what's the matter with them? That fentanyl turns the key in their system. And where we certainly would agree with her would be, well, let's make sure whatever fentanyl they take is, safe and pure, and they're not mixing all kinds of combinations of fentanyl. So she's against some drugs. She's against some drugs. And,
for some reasons,
you have to ferret out which they are. She's against fentanyl.
Right.
So she thinks drugs are bad. Some people, including presumably her, shouldn't take some bad drugs. And some drugs, I think she would say, should just be banned. People were taking all kinds of alcohol mixtures and it was all illegal. We're against that, which is why we're against prohibition. You should be able to go someplace and there's a state store and they say, well, this is actual whiskey if you want to drink whiskey, for better or for worse. So drugs are bad. She's against certain drugs. And here's the key part. Maia is like a delusional anti-drug person. She committed herself to harm reduction. Harm reduction, she feels, saved her life. While she was shooting up, somebody explained to her about clean needles. And she says, I didn't get AIDS. God bless them. And I agree. She's fine now. That's a good idea. But harm reduction became her, cross of Maia of Arc, St. Joan, St. Maia. And she's committed to. So here's where my argument with her most breaks down. Harm reduction. She has an article she wrote in 2015. This is unbelievable to me. The name of the article in 2015 was Never before has our approach to drugs improved so much so fast. We're winning. She wrote that in 2015. And anybody who's been around the block lately doesn't feel we're winning. You know what I mean? I believe Maia thinks we're winning. And okay, let's go back.
If it weren't for pesky fentanyl.
What's that?
In her mind, we're winning if it weren't for pesky fentanyl.
Well, and we haven't done enough methadone and buprenorphine. I mean, we've done a ton. I mean, it's available to 50 to 60% of Americans. That's a ton of Americans. But drug deaths have climbed unbelievably. I mean, in the 1960s, people took heroin in the streets. And in the 1990s, maybe 5,000 or 7,000 people were dying a year. And now we're up to 110,000. So how does she think we're winning? And it goes back. The drug warriors would say, oh, we know how to win the war on drugs. Eliminate all drugs. They know the answer. Unfortunately, we never can do that. Then let's go to AA and the brain disease. They would say, AA would say, oh, we just have to get everybody who's addicted into a 12-step program. And then we'll eliminate addiction. That's their answer. And the drug warriors still believe that. And the 12-step people still believe that. Mm-hmm. And Maia's version of that rap is, we just, of course, remember now, she was addicted to heroin and cocaine. Buprenorphine and methadone don't have to do with cocaine. So that's already one quick shuffle.
And did she take either of them on her journey out of being addicted to them? I don't remember.
Yeah, she says she was taking them just before she went to rehab. She was taking them, I think she says 20 times a day she was shooting up.
No, but did she take methadone or buprenorphine ever?
Oh,
was that not even a part of her
point? Oh, I got better without buprenorphine or methadone. I don't think she ever used them. They weren't around. Well, methadone's been around forever. So she doesn't even have that. She got better under the 12 steps, which she more or less rejects. But by the logic of, oh, look what made me better, that would be, although she takes whatever she takes, anti-ADHD drugs or antidepressants. She does take pharmaceuticals, so that's a whole thing. But she doesn't use buprenorphine or methadone. But her answer is, we could cure addiction if buprenorphine and methadone were more widespread. So here's the delusional part. Everybody now looks back at the drug war and says, well, that idea that we could eliminate addiction if we eliminated drugs, it's crazy because people took those drugs without being addicted, A. I mean, we'll never eliminate those drugs. So that's not even a discussion. We look back at the 12-step thing and we say, oh, if we just get people to swear to God that they're powerless and we got everybody in an AA group, then we'd eliminate addiction. But now you and I, and a lot of people look back and say, well, that's not going to work. AA's been around forever and 5 or 10% of people go to it. And even them, they're not tremendously successful. And Maia is the harm reduction version of that. We have methadone and buprenorphine. I know we are at record level drug deaths. 2022, 110,000 deaths because not enough people are taking buprenorphine and methadone and Suboxone. And so if you were to have a logical discussion with her, if she was somebody close to you, you would say, okay, we don't have everybody on that, but we sure have a ton more people on those drugs.
Yeah. You know, if the idea that, right, more more of these drugs are being pushed and people taking them than ever, more people are dying than ever. And she says, oh, yeah, but fentanyl. But even, okay, so let's eliminate totally that whole.
But she'll say, more, okay.
But there should be more.
Not enough people are taking
them. Right. But she'll say not enough people are getting them. And I guess I wonder if I could break that logic just a little bit. What happens to the people who have no interest in taking them?
And a lot of the people who have no interest in taking them have taken them.
Right. That's true, too.
I mean, it's not just that they said, take this, and they say, no, thanks. There's a tremendous drop-off of about 3/4 of people who are exposed to those therapies. There's that famous case in Massachusetts, the state Supreme Court, Maia wrote about, but the woman who was imprisoned for violating probation, she was on buprenorphine and she took fentanyl, which was her preferred drug, her previous drug of choice, and buprenorphine didn't work for her, so she did positive for fentanyl.
And Maia would say that buprenorphine could have saved her life because that kept her tolerance at some level
but she was taking, she was already on a drug maintenance program.
Right.
Didn't keep it. So
Right. So she's saying,
a high enough dose, I think
right.
she'd say.
Right. She's saying she had some consistent tolerance built up, so fentanyl maybe didn't kill her, so that would have saved her life. So she has an answer for all of this, and I just don't think we'll ever see eye to eye.
Well, one of your best answers once when I said to you, Ethan Edelman used to say, people in the 12-step movement have to answer for the fact that while they were saying nobody should take drugs, hundreds of thousands of people died of AIDS. And then I say to you, well, what's Ethan going to say? Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Drug Policy Alliance was created in 2000. And you have a pretty good line there. You say, oh, he would say, well, we're not as stupid as the AA people. We don't believe in total abstinence. So they make a quick shuffle and they say, well, I know a lot of people are dying, since we've become prominent and since some of our policies have been initiated, but we're not as stupid as those abstinence people. It's like a comparative thing. And when that rings in my mind with, I haven't heard Maya answer this directly. Maya, why are more people than ever dying from drug use? And her answer is, well, fentanyl's bad, but people are still taking combinations of fentanyl, with other drugs. They're taking them now with meth and with tranquilizers. And they're taking them to a large extent voluntarily. It's not, I mean, they don't know exactly what they're getting, but they want fentanyl. It's the same old story. People want drugs. They're in situations where they use them in unhealthy ways. When they're on the black market, you're definitely more liable for trouble. So her answer would be very similar to the old drug warrior answer and the old AA answer. Well, we have the answer to prevent people from being addicted or from dying due to these drugs. I know drug deaths are really increasing rapidly. It's just a matter of implementing what we know to work. It's been proven to work more efficiently in a wider spread way. So when I sit there at night, stoned, no, and I'm just thinking, I'm saying, I'm 77. That argument is the same argument I've been hearing my whole life. And I think we can summarize this way. I think you and I would say we're not into recovery. We're into people living their lives. In general, if people are living a good life, a satisfied life, a life where they belong and they feel gratified, they'll be okay. And so we can close there. All of a sudden, we wrote about him. We wrote about in our famous book called Outgrowing Addiction, we wrote about Keith Richards. Keith Richards has sort of become famous now as a model drug user. He's got some rap like, well, I quit heroin in whenever, 1990, whenever. I quit cocaine in like 2008, whenever, somewhere in there. I quit smoking. He's 79 years old. He quit smoking in 2019.
I was going to say like last year or something. Yeah.
That took a while, and he still drinks. But I just read in Medium, I couldn't believe it. Somebody in the recovery thing was really putting him up, and they say he's really a role model. And I agree. He's 79. They've just gone back, him and Mick Jagger have just gone back in the studio. They're writing original material. They've got enough for 2 albums. They have done tours. He's got a ton of friends in the music business. That's the Medium article says. He plays reggae with guys in the Caribbean. He loves music. He's got a purpose in life. You never sort of see Keith Richards without his guitar. He likes playing the guitar. He likes writing music. He likes playing music with all different kinds of people. A, and the medium says he's sort of a role model. And B, somebody will mention when he was originally with the Rolling Stones, he probably had sex with a lot of stray women. But he's been married for 40 years now to Patty Hansen. He has 2 daughters with Patty Hansen who are something like 28 or 30 now. And when they interview them, it's sort of hard to believe. They say, we sort of didn't know our father was famous. How could you not know that your father, Keith Richards, is famous?
Mm-hmm.
When they didn't even, and he made them go to a public high school. And he drove them to school. He's sort of like a regular guy. He has a wife. He has 2 daughters. And then one of the funniest things I thought was one of his daughters got caught spray painting a building. So they called Keith Richards and they caught her with marijuana. This is so Keith Richards. And it makes me cry. He said, I don't want you spray painting public buildings. Keith Richards has solid middle-class values. We pay taxes in this town. It makes things look ugly. Why don't you give me the marijuana? And then in the interview, he said, is it any good? And his line was, what am I going to tell her? Not to take marijuana? I'm going to call the kettle black? Whatever the hell that is.
Right.
Like I'm going to say, oh, never take drugs? So how did Keith Richards took heroin? He took cocaine. He took street heroin. He smoked. That could never be good for you. But he's had a purpose in life. He's healthy, for God's sake. For a 79-year-old, it's hard to do those tours when you're 79 years old. He's got a good relationship. He's been married for 40 years. He's got a good relationship. He's got 4 children. He's got a good relationship with his daughters and with Marlon, who was he had with his, I don't know if it was his first wife, but he's like a good regular citizen. And he's over all of his drug addictions. He still drinks occasionally. Once he licks cigarettes, he's put all of his addictions behind him. He's healthy and he's ready to go. And that's how you and we put him as a case study. He should have quit smoking earlier. It probably wasn't so good for him because he was getting arrested with the heroin. But he's lived his life in a positive manner with positive relationships professionally. He's, him and Mick are back together again. And he's got a purpose in working in life. He has values. He doesn't want his daughters chalking up, spray painting buildings. And that's called living. And, there's a ton of drugs he took that he shouldn't have taken. But everybody's doing something wrong, that they shouldn't be doing. And that is the opposite of, he doesn't say, when they interview him, he says, I quit heroin whenever, 1995, cocaine, that. He never says, nobody should ever take heroin, it's bad. Nobody should ever take cocaine, it's bad. He doesn't even, I didn't even know, did he tell his daughters? He never even says smoking is bad. He certainly doesn't say alcohol is bad. He just says, I quit them. And now, I'm okay. And Keith Richards shares a view of how to use drugs and to be addicted and not be addicted more with us than we do, I think, with Maia Szalavitz.